I'm going to divide my remarks into three parts. I'm going to talk about what was going on before we were hit by this, because you touched on some of that, but I can add a little. Then I will talk about what I think the impact of the pandemic is. And then finally, I will do the most daring thing and talk about the future. So the background is, and I'm focusing on globalization. So after the global financial crisis of, let's say, 2007 to 9, just give a number, the relationship in world trade and world economic output changed fundamentally. And in particularly, world trade slowed sharply relative to world output, which also slowed. So world trade has been growing much more slowly since the financial crisis than before. And in that context, among other things, it's pretty clear that supply chain unbundling across borders slowed very considerably, and in fact has continued to do so. So the great episode of globalization from, say, let's say 1980 really ended with the financial crisis. In the more recent past, the last 4 years, we've also seen the emergence in that context of a trade war between the US and many of its trading partners, but above all China, and a generalized assault, again, principally coming from the US, but nobody was much on the other side, on the idea of a multilateral system in which, of course, a system of rules, culminating with essentially the closure of the appellate body of the WTO. So globalization was very sick to start with. Second, the pandemic. This is a massive economic shock. Nobody knows how long it will last, but in terms of depth and speed, this is clearly the biggest economic slump in peacetime since the Great Depression, and quite probably the biggest slump on record. Since the mid-19th century. It's above all, it's affecting more countries than ever before. In the context of this immense economic shock, with, as you said, huge falls in output and trade, a particular feature, of course, was the shortage of medical equipment, and to a lesser degree, concerns also about food. Those were the most obvious things. The main reason for that was very, very simple. We hadn't prepared for it globally, and we didn't have the production capacity to generate all the equipment that was going to be needed, the drugs, the ventilators, the masks. We didn't have the production capacity, we didn't have the stocks. We didn't have it in aggregate anywhere. In that situation of generalized shortage and panic, export restrictions were imposed by many of the countries that could produce it. This, of course, created panic, real panic, and huge problems in countries that wanted to import relevant equipment across the range, and of course often disrupted supply chains, making it very, very difficult for countries that wanted to increase capacity to actually do so if they relied to any significant degree on imported components or imported materials. So it was highly disruptive. One example of this is that 80 countries actually eliminated import barriers on medical equipment, but the export controls of supplying countries meant that this was essentially an irrelevant decision on their part. So essentially, the trade policy, export restrictions are permitted, but it was very disruptive, no doubt. By now, a lot of the supply shortages have been eliminated and the supply position looks much better. But of course, people remember this and it will affect their future decisions. Now, the future, well, it seems to me that we can view the future in terms of the mistakes we should avoid and the opportunity we can seize. The mistakes are, of course, to go in the 1930s protectionist mistake. We got a huge recession, so that everybody wants to create jobs, so they go into 1930s style protection. There's a geopolitical mistake. Everybody wants to blame somebody else for what's gone wrong, And it's pretty clear the US wants to blame China, and China in turn is going to blame the US for incompetence. This will not go well. The third mistake is what I call the self-sufficiency mistake, the idea that every country in the world has to be self-sufficient in everything, which will be immensely costly. And it's very, very clear, I can go into this much more later, will not guarantee safety. Self-sufficiency does not guarantee safety. And then there's the opportunity. Well, you've mentioned one, digital globalization, but I think there's an opportunity to think about resilience and redundancy in our systems coherently. Resilience is a public good. And there is a need, in my view, for government institutions that think about this in relationship and alongside the private sector. But finally, I think it would be a catastrophe if the conclusion we drew from this is that every country should go back to the sort of self-sufficiency so many countries tried in the 50s, particularly in the developing world, and of course in the Soviet bloc, all of which ended very, very badly.